What if I told you that while most of Africa turned its back, one unexpected nation stepped up and changed everything? Just days after a failed coup rocked Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood surrounded by silence. Accused. Targeted. Isolated. Not a single neighbor spoke out. But then, shockingly, it was Morocco who broke ranks. Not just with words, but with a gift so bold, it might rewrite the future of West Africa. This isn't just politics. This is survival. So if you're ready to hear what really happened, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because this story will change how you see African unity forever. If you believe that a small nation can still stand tall against the weight of global powers. If you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story, in its own voice, on its own terms. If you've ever seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes and felt something stir inside you, then this story belongs to you too. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Not just to support, but to stand with us. Together, we are riding a new wave of awakening. What once were whispers, have now become a silent storm. And it's only just beginning. And that's exactly where the silence became deafening. Just hours after the failed coup attempt on April 16, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the heart of a political storm. Accusations filled the air. Foreign-backed whispers spoke of betrayal. But what chilled most wasn't the threat itself, it was the response that followed. Or rather, the lack of it. One by one, neighboring African nations remained quiet. No condemnations. No calls for stability. No words of solidarity. Traoré, a leader who had risked everything to reclaim his country's sovereignty, found himself abandoned. Not by enemies, but by supposed allies. Nigeria, the region's heavyweight, said nothing. Ivory Coast and Benin, often parading their commitment to African unity, remained mute. In some cases, their silence looked like complicity. Intelligence began to surface, pointing to operational centers near the Ivorian border, allegedly hosting foreign agents, coordinating destabilization efforts. For a continent that preaches Pan-Africanism, this was betrayal. The streets of Ouagadougou felt tense. Soldiers were stationed at key locations. Rumors swirled of internal leaks and external threats. But the most unnerving reality was that Africa's so-called defenders of democracy were watching from afar, arms folded, eyes averted. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not flinch. But behind the scenes, the weight of that silence was heavy. In a moment that demanded unity, Africa hesitated. It exposed a crack that runs deep through the continent's political soul, a willingness to trade solidarity for silence, sovereignty for foreign favor. This is where the story truly begins, not with the coup attempt itself, but with the choices made after. Choices that would soon be shattered by a single unexpected act from the north. But then, just when the silence felt unbearable, came the shock no one expected. From the far north of the continent, a voice broke through. Not a whisper. Not a vague statement. A bold, calculated act. Morocco stepped forward. While Captain Ibrahim Traoré faced isolation, Morocco's King Mohammed VI did something no other African leader dared. He opened his country's Atlantic ports to Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the heart of the AES alliance. For three landlocked nations cornered by sanctions and foreign pressure, this wasn't just logistics. It was lifeline. Lifesaver. Game changer. And it wasn't just ports. Morocco pledged military cooperation, trade routes, cancelled debts, and lifted customs duties on AES exports. A gift, but not wrapped in pity. It was a declaration. We see you. We stand with you. At a time when ECOWAS had closed borders and Western allies tightened their grip, Morocco unlatched a door to freedom. It stunned the region. Analysts were caught off guard. The usual narrative, that military governments deserve isolation, began to fall apart. Because now, one of Africa's most stable and strategic kingdoms was offering open arms to those cast aside. And it wasn't a bluff. Weeks earlier, intelligence confirmed that Benin had seized Niger's oil exports. Ivory Coast was hosting Western operations. But Morocco? Morocco hosted the foreign ministers of the AES. On its own soil. Under its own flag. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't speak much about it in public. But insiders say the mood in Ouagadougou shifted that day. Something broke. Something opened. For once, the world saw a different kind of alliance, not based on military force or foreign handouts, but on respect, strategy, and shared survival. This was not just a diplomatic gesture. It was an act of rebellion against the narrative that Africa must wait for permission to act. Morocco didn't ask. It offered. And in doing so, it reminded the continent, and the world, that African unity isn't a fantasy. It's a choice. One that begins with courage. And that courage started with one unexpected gift, for a captain left standing alone. And that's where the story flips, where silence turns into defiance, and isolation becomes a stage for reversal. The moment Morocco offered its ports to the AES nations, it didn't just help them escape geographical limits, it shattered a decades-old power structure. For years, countries like Burkina Faso, under leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré, were forced to rely on neighbors like Benin and Ivory Coast. But those routes had become weaponized. Niger's oil was seized in Benin. Intelligence tied destabilization efforts to Ivorian territory. What was once regional cooperation had turned into quiet sabotage. Then came Morocco, not as a savior, but as a mirror held up to the rest of Africa. By bypassing the traditional corridors, Morocco exposed the hypocrisy of so-called democratic neighbors. These were nations who preached integration but served foreign interests. ECOWAS spoke of constitutional order, yet enforced it with economic strangulation. Sanctions weren't political tools, they were weapons. In Niger, the lights went out. Hospitals collapsed. And not a single Western nation blinked. Now, with Moroccan ports wide open, the AES countries had a new path. No more begging for access. No more threats disguised as diplomacy. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his allies, this was more than trade. It was dignity. And dignity, once tasted, cannot be forgotten. The symbolism couldn't be stronger. A monarchy, Morocco, chose to support military-led governments, while elected ones watched in silence. King Mohammed VI understood something the others missed, that the true test of Pan-Africanism isn't about titles or constitutions. It's about action in crisis. And when Traoré faced betrayal, Morocco acted. But perhaps the most shocking reversal of all was what happened next. Foreign policy circles across Europe were rattled. If Morocco, a long-standing Western partner, could extend trust to the AES, what did that mean for France? For ECOWAS? For the idea that isolation keeps regimes in check? They realized too late, this wasn't isolation anymore. It was alliance. Traoré's position, once seen as defiant, now looked prophetic. He had called for Africa to stop outsourcing its future. He had warned of the danger in trusting those who never saw Africans as equals. And now, one of Africa's most influential monarchs was backing that vision, not with talk, but with infrastructure, with economic relief, and with political weight. The tide was turning. Not in a burst of revolution, but in strategic, quiet moves that rewrote the rules of the game. While others underestimated the AES alliance, Morocco validated it. While some dismissed Traoré as radical, Morocco treated him as a statesman. And suddenly, the man who once stood alone was no longer standing alone at all. And while Morocco took action, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did something even more remarkable. He didn't gloat. He didn't rush to the podium or call press conferences. He stayed still. Poised. Focused. That silence, once a burden, became his weapon. At a time when most leaders would scramble for headlines or try to justify themselves to international critics, Captain Traoré stood tall and let the facts speak. While others panicked about legitimacy, he prioritized sovereignty. While the West shouted about democracy, he built roads, reopened factories, and poured resources into defense. No grand declarations. Just work. Just results. And behind that calm exterior was a man under siege. From the moment the coup attempt failed, intelligence officers reported signs of infiltration. Foreign agents posing as telecom engineers. Unexplained signals traced to outside borders. Whispers of betrayal within the ranks. It wasn't just a political attack. It was psychological. Designed to rattle him. To make him doubt his own command. But he didn't flinch. Sources inside the presidency say Captain Traoré spent that week in constant communication with AES leaders, not to ask for help, but to coordinate. To hold the line. Even as the betrayal from ECOWAS became clearer, even as Niger suffered blackouts and sanctions began to bite, he kept his cool. His discipline wasn't just military, it was strategic. And Morocco saw it. According to diplomatic insiders, King Mohammed VI had followed Traoré's leadership for months. What impressed him wasn't just the rhetoric, it was the restraint. The refusal to lash out. The refusal to beg. That composure, that ability to endure pressure and remain focused on the mission, that was the quality of a leader, not a rebel. And that's why Morocco acted. It wasn't just about ports or trade. It was about recognizing a kind of leadership that Africa has rarely celebrated. One built not on applause, but on resilience. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, despite being surrounded by hostile powers, had not blinked. He had not compromised. He had not turned to the West for approval. And that silent strength resonated. In a world of noise, Captain Traoré's silence was louder than any speech. It was the silence of a man who knew the truth, that real change is never gifted, it's earned. That unity cannot be begged for, it must be built. And as Morocco stepped forward, the world saw what leadership looks like when it's forged in fire, not fame. That week, Traoré didn't speak much. But his every move shouted one message loud and clear: we will not be broken. And that brings us to the final line, the point where silence and betrayal become more than just diplomatic drama. They become moral choices. And in that defining moment, Morocco drew its line. So did Captain Ibrahim Traoré. This wasn't just about trade routes or seaport access anymore. It was about what kind of Africa we want to build, and who gets to shape it. For decades, ECOWAS claimed to be the guardian of regional democracy. But when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger demanded sovereignty, ECOWAS turned from referee to executioner. The sanctions weren't just economic, they were humanitarian disasters. In Niger, power was cut. Medicines ran dry. Babies died in dark hospitals. And while the West applauded the pressure, African leaders stayed quiet. Captain Ibrahim Traoré refused to stay silent. He publicly challenged the logic behind these sanctions. He asked the hard questions no one else dared. If democracy is truly about the will of the people, why are you punishing nations whose people chose a different path? Why does ECOWAS ignore coups in Chad but destroy livelihoods in the Sahel? His words didn't win applause in Brussels or Paris, but they did spark something across the continent. Youth movements began quoting him. Journalists in Senegal and Cameroon started re-evaluating the AES position. And ordinary citizens, tired of elite hypocrisy, began asking themselves, whose side are we really on? Morocco's decision to break with the silence was more than just support. It was a declaration that Africa no longer has to follow pre-written scripts. That leadership can come from anywhere, even from the embattled streets of Ouagadougou. And that's what scared the old order most. Because if one king could defy the diplomatic consensus, others might follow. If Captain Ibrahim Traoré could stand tall without foreign approval, maybe sovereignty wasn't a threat, maybe it was a right. The moral confrontation was now unavoidable. On one side stood the AES alliance, scarred, sanctioned, but unyielding. On the other, the polished regimes of ECOWAS, compliant, well-funded, but morally hollow. Morocco chose its side. And in doing so, it exposed every silent nation. Every leader who watched suffering unfold and said nothing. Every voice that claimed to defend Africa, but only on terms approved in Washington or Paris. This is no longer just a geopolitical feud. It is a test of character. And in that test, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't just pass, he rewrote the standard. He proved that silence can be broken. That betrayal can be answered. That even when the world turns its back, a leader can still rise, not with permission, but with purpose. Because in the end, this story isn't just about ports or politics. It's about dignity. And some leaders, like Traoré, refuse to let it be taken. And so, what began with betrayal has ended in revelation. When the world turned away from the Sahel, when the silence from African capitals screamed louder than any condemnation, when sanctions punished the innocent and diplomacy became a weapon, one alliance held the line. And at the center of it stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Not with speeches. Not with slogans. But with sheer resolve. What Morocco did was not just diplomatic, it was revolutionary. In offering port access, economic lifelines, and genuine solidarity, King Mohammed VI didn't just throw a rope to drowning nations. He forced a mirror on the rest of Africa. He exposed the double standards. He asked, without saying a word, what are you doing for your brothers? This question lingers, not just in meeting rooms or embassies, but in the hearts of millions. Young Africans, watching from Accra, from Kigali, from Kinshasa, are no longer just following stories. They're weighing sides. They're questioning why the very nations that once dreamed of unity are now punishing those who dare to live it. Captain Ibrahim Traoré never claimed to be perfect. He didn't come to power through polished elections or Western-backed deals. He emerged through necessity, in a country crying out for leadership, in a region tired of being used, in a generation that no longer wanted to wait. And through every test, the failed coup, the foreign interference, the betrayal by neighbors, he stood firm. But he didn't stand alone. That's what Morocco changed. It took the first step. And with that step, it redefined what leadership in Africa could look like. Not driven by aid or applause, but by values. Not shaped in Paris or Washington, but forged on African soil, in African hands. The question now isn't whether unity is possible. It's whether others are brave enough to act. To speak. To support without waiting for permission. Because what Traoré and Morocco have shown is that African unity doesn't need permission, it needs courage. It needs the willingness to risk comfort for principle. This is the blueprint now. No more waiting for foreign investments that come with chains. No more empty summits where Pan-Africanism is recited like an old psalm with no meaning. No more punishing nations for choosing themselves. If Africa is to rise, it must do so together. Not as 54 pieces, but as one collective will, strong enough to shape its own future. And maybe, just maybe, history will look back on this moment, the ports opened, the silence shattered, the captain unbroken, as the turning point. As the day when unity stopped being a dream, and finally became a decision. If you believe that even a small nation can rise tall against the weight of global powers, if you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story, not in borrowed language, but in its own voice, on its own terms, if you've ever seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes and felt it burn something awake in your soul, then this story is yours too. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not just to show support, but to stand beside a movement, because what began as whispers in the dark, has become a silent storm, and together, we are riding its wave, into a new dawn for Africa. This story offers more than a political update. It delivers a deep lesson about courage, principle, and the future of Africa. At its core, the experience of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the support shown by Morocco reveal the high price of sovereignty, and the rare power of true solidarity. One of the first lessons is that leadership is often proven in silence, not when the world praises you, but when it abandons you. Captain Traoré stood nearly alone after the failed coup attempt. Instead of collapsing under pressure, he stood firm. He didn't seek validation from Western powers or try to appease his regional critics. He focused on protecting his people, defending his nation's independence, and building internal strength. This teaches us that real leadership isn't about popularity, it's about commitment to your principles, even when the cost is high. The second lesson comes from Morocco's bold decision. At a time when most countries distanced themselves from the AES alliance, Morocco chose to act based on values, not convenience. It opened its ports, forgave debts, and offered economic lifelines, not for political leverage, but because it believed in African-led solutions. This shows that in a continent often divided by borders, history, and foreign interests, genuine Pan-African solidarity is still possible, but only if leaders are willing to take risks for the greater good. Another key lesson lies in the contrast between actions and rhetoric. While ECOWAS and other bodies claim to defend democracy, their sanctions caused humanitarian suffering. Morocco, meanwhile, provided practical support without preconditions. The AES nations, though led by military governments, demonstrated more unity, respect, and long-term vision than many so-called democratic regimes. This challenges the idea that legitimacy comes only from formality. Sometimes, legitimacy is earned through service and sacrifice. There's also a powerful reminder about economic independence. For decades, the AES countries relied on trade routes through neighboring states that eventually became hostile. Morocco's intervention broke that dependency. It showed that geography doesn't have to be destiny, that with the right partnerships, even landlocked nations can access global markets and stand on their own. Economic sovereignty is possible when nations help each other instead of competing for foreign favor. Finally, the story reminds us that unity starts with one choice. Morocco made that choice. So did Traoré. And together, they've lit a fire that could spread across the continent. If more African nations follow their lead, rejecting foreign control, supporting one another, and building alliances based on respect, then Africa's future will no longer be dictated by outsiders. It will be written by Africans themselves. The lesson is clear: when courage meets solidarity, even the most isolated can rise. And when one nation dares to stand, others may remember how to walk. The audience's reaction to this story has been nothing short of powerful. Many viewers expressed deep admiration for Morocco's bold stance, calling decision to support Burkina Faso and the AES alliance resonated with everyday people. Commenters praised King Mohammed VI for choosing courage over convenience, action over rhetoric. For them, this wasn't just about ports, it was about restoring dignity to forgotten nations. Captain Ibrahim Traoré also received overwhelming support. Viewers described him as a symbol of resilience, someone who refused to be broken even when left isolated. His silent strength, his refusal to seek Western approval, and his dedication to national sovereignty struck a chord with many. Several comments compared him to historical revolutionaries, noting that real leaders don't wait for permission, they act when their people need them most. Others were angry, not at Traoré or Morocco, but at the double standards of regional powers like ECOWAS and the African Union. Many questioned why these institutions failed to support their own while bowing to foreign pressure. Some even suggested that Morocco had done more for African unity in one gesture than ECOWAS had in decades. Across the board, the comments section reflected a growing awareness that Africa is changing. People are no longer satisfied with empty words and diplomatic showmanship. They want real action. They want solidarity. And most of all, they want leaders who fight for the people, not for favor from the West. To the audience, this wasn't just a political development. It was hope. A signal that a new generation of African leadership is rising, and this time, they are not backing down.